Guys, I have a special announcement for you. Next month on August 18th and 19th, Father Sergius will be speaking at a retreat at the parish St. Matthew the Evangelist in North Royalton, Ohio. That is in the Cleveland area, for those not familiar. Father Sergius, who is he, you might ask? For those of you who don't know, since 2010, he has been the 16th and current abbot of St. Tikhon of Zadonsk Monastery in Pennsylvania, the oldest monastery in America. St. Tikhon is also known for the renowned seminary. Father Sergius will be speaking on the subject matter of his new book, Acquiring the Mind of Christ, Embracing the Vision of the Orthodox Church. In addition, he will be bringing the miracle-working icon of St. Anna, the mother of the Holy Virgin Mary, for prayer and veneration. This icon of St. Anna began weeping myrrh on Mother's Day, how perfect is that, of 2004. It has since stopped weeping, but exudes a wonderful heavenly fragrance to this very day. She is said to provide assistance and healing to the faithful that pray with her, especially to couples who are praying for a child. So this retreat, what is it, you ask? Well, it begins with a prayer service at 6 p.m. on Friday, with the first session to follow. The rest of the event will take place from 9:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Saturday, to be completed with the Vespers service. Any that wish may participate in the liturgy on Sunday, of course, Sunday morning, where Father Sergius will be giving the sermon. Snacks and meals will be provided, and the retreat is free for all people. Free, guys. Please join Father Sergius and our brothers and sisters at St. Matthew in North Royalton, Ohio, for a spiritually enriching weekend of prayer and fellowship. If you would like to know more, go to www.stmattroyalton.org. That's STMatt, M-A-T-T, Royalton.org, and look for the current events in the event page. Please be sure to RSVP as soon as possible with the contacts listed so they know about how much food to provide. And please tell them I sent you. Say Buck Johnson from the Counterflow podcast sent me. St. Matthew will be glad to have you. Thank you, and God bless.
You are now listening to the Counterflow Podcast, a place for dissonant voices and unapproved opinions.
You get split in half, but I call the hologram brass. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Here is your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back. Once again, this is the Counterflow Podcast, and as always, I am your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson. Like I said last week, these do drop live. They debut live, I guess we can say. They premiere, let's put it that way, every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. Central Time. So I hope you're watching it live, and we can chat it up in the live chat on the YouTube page. I should say also, I do have the guest booked for this Thursday. This Thursday, the 20th of July, our live Zoom Patreon supporter group will happen. The guest will be none other than Father Turbo Qualls. That will be at 6 p.m. Central Time sharp, guys, 6 p.m. this time instead of 7. If you're in the special club, you'll get the notification, of course. I'll send you the link to get into the Zoom call, and Father Turbo Qualls will be our guest. He's always requested, and he has been gracious enough to bless us with some of his time. And let's see, to get in that club, it's patreon.com/counterflow. $5 or more per month get you in. And I think you guys know it's going to be fun. You have all access to Father Turbo this Thursday. And again, it's not recorded. These are not posted anywhere. It's private. It's between the guest, myself, and you guys on the Zoom call. And looking forward to that. Like I said last week on my episode with Matt Erickson and Adam Patrick, this week is Father John Strickland. And I wanted that to be our kind of layman's primer on what we're going to discuss this week with an actual priest, the author of the book series, Paradise and Utopia, The Rise and Fall of What the West Once Was. And it's a 4-part series. The first one is the Age of Utopia. The second one is the Age of Paradise, and then the Age of Division. I might have got those out of order, but I do know the fourth one is the Age of Nihilism. So we're getting into that today. I think you're going to love it. And I mentioned it last week at the end, but I should say it this week at the beginning. Thank you to Father Bob for helping me realize I had the first part of this book series, And like I said earlier, we've been reading it on Adam Patrick's show, The Age of Information. I read one sitting with him, if you will. Matt Erickson did another one. So I knew the first three were out, and I didn't even know this fourth one was out until I was up at Christ the Savior Orthodox Cathedral in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, with Amy and Julie, the wonderful twins. And the great priest there, Father Bob, said, yeah, the fourth one's out. Here it is. So I started reading through it and immediately ordered it. And that was very helpful in getting prepped for this interview with Father John Strickland. So without further ado, I will tell you, Father John Strickland serves as a priest at St. Elizabeth Orthodox Church in Washington State. We're going to say that. I can't even say the name of the city. We'll get into that with him here. He's the author of The Making of Holy Russia. And then, of course, this wonderful book series that we're going to talk all about on this episode. Father John Strickland, welcome to the show, sir. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Good to be with you, Buck.
Good to have you here. What a book series. And we should talk about the podcast series that kind of goes along with it. But before we get into it, I'll let you give my audience whatever kind of intro you think they should hear from you.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure what to say. I'm the pastor, the rector of an Orthodox parish in Poulsbo, Washington, which is on the Kitsap Peninsula across from Seattle, to the west of Seattle, across Puget Sound. I've been a priest here at this parish for almost 9 years now. And in addition to that, and when I have time for it, my main work is definitely being a pastor here. But when I have opportunity for it, I've been involved in podcasting and blogging, and especially in this case, writing a series of books. I had, before I became a priest, a pretty long time teaching college history. I earned a PhD in Russian history mainly, but modern European history. And I always had this desire to be able to do what I just didn't feel like anyone had really properly done. And that is, and I'm not sure I did it properly either, but that is to provide a history of the West from a Christian point of view, and especially from an Eastern Christian or Orthodox point of view. I'm an Orthodox Christian, and so I see the West from that point of view. I was once not a Orthodox. I was raised Protestant, and I'm as American as anyone can get, as Western as anyone can get. But it was very important to me to be able to provide that, because we just, when I was in graduate school at the state university system, when I was undergraduate, and just moving through our society generally, the media and the government and Hollywood and just everything, the internet, Orthodoxy is almost invisible. The best kept religious secret, it's sometimes called here in America, in the West. And on top of that, the people who did write a history of the West from a Christian point of view did so from a Roman Catholic or Protestant one oftentimes, which just missed a great deal of what I think is really the key to understanding where we are today. And so I wanted to write this history, which I subtitled The Rise and Fall of What the West Once Was. And I finished it up last year, and now I'm happy to be able to move on to other things.
Yeah, when I became Orthodox and leading up to that point, one of the things I kept noticing about it is that it seemed to color in all of the lines. Basically, it filled in the gaps that I was I had been looking for something to fill in the gaps through politics or through philosophy or whatever. And then you find Orthodoxy and it's like, oh, this contextualizes everything. This fills in the gaps. This colors between the lines. And so it's interesting you say that, because that's kind of what your books did too. And I want to hold up the first one for my audience, my video audience to see, and the first and the last, appropriately enough. And we're going to get into this broad series. You kind of touched upon it there. One of the things I liked about it, I have studied history, not as deeply as you for sure, but in my political circles, there's been often moments where people try to go back in time and figure out, how did we get to where we are now? And maybe it was the war between the states. No, maybe it was World War I kind of kicked everything off. And then you hear maybe it was the 1960s and the hippie age and postmodernism. Yet, much like when I discovered some writings by Father Seraphim Rose, and I believe it was his Orthodox, geez, I'm blanking on it. Basically, a Orthodox survival guide. That's what it was.
That's what it was, yeah.
He tied a lot of it back to what's called the Great Schism, what you call the Great Divide, often in the book. And until I read your book, I had not read anyone else that said basically what Father Seraphim Rose was saying. So I kind of want to ask you, what made you want to go back much further than most people go back when they're trying to tie, like, well, where did we fall? Where did the West go wrong? What made you want to go back even further?
Yeah, because that is, Seraphim was right. That is really, as I understand it, the key. I came across Seraphim Rose, after I had already converted to Orthodoxy, and found some of his books very helpful and very insightful, and I really liked some of his writings. And then I was really pleased to find the very thin book. Really, it's a publication of his really notes toward a history, such as maybe I tried to write myself, called Nihilism, simply. Mm-hmm. And so I was aware that he had already kind of been out there to say something maybe similar to what I was trying to say myself. I even looked through his book called Nihilism as a possibility for the epigraph or kind of opening quotation of my final book on the Age of Nihilism. But I decided finally against that and used Psalm 136 instead. Mm-hmm. But yeah, he was in the back of my mind a little bit from time to time, and I think he really had some wonderful insights. As far as my own sense of why I went back so far, I really believe that these efforts that I just alluded to a moment ago to make sense of where the West is right now, and most accounts of that really are pretty pessimistic accounts. I mean, a lot of people are looking around today, looking at our culture and society and thinking, what has happened here? This is incredible. I mean, some of the changes that are just, that have created a new norm today were inconceivable 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when I grew up, for instance. So, like, how to make sense of that? And I think the failure of most Western scholarship and writing about history is that it does look no further than, like you said, the sexual revolution or hippie movement of the 60s, countercultural movement then. One might look at World War I, like you did. That was certainly a watershed. The collapse, and that's why I start my Age of Nihilism with the First World War, because that so-called Great War really did bring about the collapse of confidence in humanism and the opening of nihilism. People go back further. The Enlightenment, of course, is a really important period. The Protestant Reformation, really important. Some people have seen the rise of something called nominalism, which is a philosophical theological school of the so-called late Middle Ages, and the Roman Catholic Church is being responsible. All of these are important, but none of them are formative. What I consider to be formative is ecclesial and sacramental. And if one reads my books, one sees throughout, especially in the age of paradise, but throughout, the fundamental issue is sacramental liturgical life. Mm-hmm. And that was altered when, from my point of view, the Roman Catholic Church formed itself in more or less 1054, to use one date. It's not a very satisfactory date, but it more or less serves the 11th century, in an event called what can be called the Papal Reformation, which reformation of Christianity in the West separated the West from the East, from the Orthodox tradition. And with that ecclesial and liturgical event, sacramental event, I really believe the seeds for a culture such as we have today were sown. And it took a long, long time to get there. And there were a lot of really good people in the West along the way, Roman Catholics, Protestants, secularists even, who tried to do good things and did beautiful things. I, for instance, in the Age of Utopia, my third volume, just love talking about Romanticism and music, classical music, Beethoven, Schubert, Tchaikovsky are some of my favorites there that I talk about. But as much as they tried to do good things, they really were unable to secure the real anchor for a healthy culture, which was found in the first millennium and then in the West lost after that Great Division that you mentioned, the Great Schism of the 11th century. And so my history really traces in its 4 volumes. The first volume is designed to show how there was a unity of East and West in Christendom, in a Christian civilization with its supporting culture, traditional Christianity. And then after this Great Division, the second volume is really the key to understanding the series, because that second volume introduces then the Great Division, the break from the East, the break from the Orthodox tradition that I understand really explains things better than anything else. And then from there on, it's just a matter of chronicling how we got to where we are today. Mm-hmm. So I think that deep past, as I call it, that deep past is really where we have to go. And that's why it's hard for a lot of us to understand what's going on today, because we're looking at the surface of our culture. We're looking at the surface events, which often shock us, and we think, wow, how can that happen? But if we go below the surface, if we go deep into the history, I think we'll find that if you go back far enough, a millennium, you'll find that. And if I can just say one thing, in a sense, the project is designed to explain where the West has come by the 21st century, but we have a whole millennium of healthy culture from what I would argue Pentecost to the 11th century, the Great Schism. Things are in many ways very healthy. And so I would want to, bring attention to the fact that this is not an anti-Western narrative. It's not a polemic against the West as a culture. I spent the whole first volume talking about how healthy the culture of the West was. And I think that's really important. But as I say in the introduction to that first volume, as C.S. Lewis, to repeat and quote him, he says, if you get to a point where things are clearly wrong, you go back to where you took the wrong turn, right? Mm-hmm. And the wrong turn was not just taken in the sexual revolution or the Enlightenment or the Protestant Reformation or the highly rationalistic philosophy of nominalism in the Roman Catholic Church. The wrong turn was really when the West ceased to be Orthodox in its spiritual roots.
We're swimming in waters now that make it often incapable for us to even imagine what it's like outside of these waters. And I want you to talk about, you mentioned 2 things in your previous answers, Christendom and Pentecost, and kind of define what Christendom was and what that means, because there's ways of seeing the world and worshiping and whatnot that are hard for us to even grasp right now, because they can be so far removed from where we are now. Can you talk about Christendom and then relate it with Pentecost and what that means for those listening that don't even know what that word is?
Sure. Yeah. We'll start with Christendom, since that's the word that's a little unusual here. So Christendom is a word that's been used a lot in English language writing in the modern. It's really a lot of the stuff we're talking about here is very modern. I mean, in the sense of the vocabulary. So we have to be aware of that and cautious as we talk about stuff. But the idea, so I use the word Christendom as a word or a term to define or denote as I define it, a civilization with a supporting culture. So I distinguish between civilization and culture. I can talk about that if that's of interest. A civilization with a supporting culture that directs its members toward the kingdom of heaven, or toward the heavenly transformation of the world. And that's how I understand Christendom to be originally. It became something else later on. I don't favor I should just say the origin of the word is actually rather Western. People in the 1st century and in the 11th century weren't walking around talking about Christendom this and Christendom that. They didn't think in those terms. It takes us in our often post-Christian culture to look back and to see a civilization with a supporting culture that directed its members toward the spiritual transformation of the world. But at the time, they weren't thinking about this. This is rather artificial historical terminology that helps us make sense of it for our generation, for our time. But the term itself is sometimes used in a very limited sense to describe a state in which Christianity prevails as a kind of dominating, almost legal and political order. Mm-hmm. Some people say Christendom began in the 4th century with the conversion of Constantine, or the appropriation of Christianity as the official religion under Emperor Theodosius, who followed him later in the 4th century. That I don't agree with. I think Christendom is something there from Pentecost forward. I think Pentecost is where we should look, not the introduction of some sort of political system. I think we should look at the very origins of our faith, and that's why my book series tries to be an ecclesial account rather than like a political account or something like that. I really think the church is where we need to look, the faith of the church from the 1st century, from Pentecost forward, to understand how our civilization and its supporting culture were ultimately transformed by Christianity. I also don't like the tendency to say Christendom somehow fell. Like people talk about the ruins of Christendom. Like there's a term I see some people using. That's a fine term to use. I would use it myself. It's good. But I don't want to suggest that Christendom is like over, like whatever, like the French Revolution brought it to an end, or whatever, Roe v. Wade brought it to an end, or something like that. Christendom is still the culture in which we live, whether atheists recognize or accept that or not. Most atheists would not say it's okay to go out and kill newborn female infants because the parents don't happen to want a female infant, but it was Christians who instilled our culture and our civilization, its supporting culture, with the conviction that that's absolutely morally reprehensible. And things like this are still part of our Christian inheritance, even when they're secularized. The feminist movement, no question about this, the feminist movement would not have happened in any other culture or civilization than the West, because it is Christendom. And as Paul said, there's no longer male or female, all are one in Christ Jesus. The Christians were the only ones to do that. So I think we still live in Christendom, but though I do somewhat playfully, I guess, use the term post-Christian Christendom,
right,
to bring attention to the fact that we'd be deluding ourselves to think everything's fine today.
Yeah, there's an extent to where, I think I've said it on this show before, modern secular atheists are still within a Christian paradigm that they're looking through, which is a twist of irony, I would think. You mentioned Pentecost.
On that point, if I may, Buck, on that point, a parallel book, another book that's out there, a single volume book by Tom Holland. Some of your audience may have read this or heard of it.
Yes.
Called, what's it called?
Dominion.
Dominion. Yes, thank you, Dominion. That book actually makes such an argument. Tom Holland, as far as I can tell, he was interviewed by Jonathan Pageau, and a little bit of his kind of Christian sympathies were kind of brought out in that account. He's certainly not Orthodox, but I think he has a kind of a respect for Christianity. And I think Kingsnorth also interviewed him with the same results, which was really interesting for me to see, because he's really the product of a secular kind of formation and publishing venture. But in Dominion, Tom Holland, made the argument that so much of what we have today, even for an atheist or a secular or something like that, is the product of Christianity in history. And I think he made that argument rather well in that book.
Can you talk about what Pentecost is? And I know this seems elementary to a lot of my listeners, but I will say, prior to discovering Orthodoxy, I didn't know what that meant. And it's very valuable once you understand it. So can you quickly touch upon what Pentecost is?
Yeah, so Pentecost is just the event that marks the beginning of church history, to put it this way. It's recounted in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, chapter 2. The author, Luke, the evangelist, talks about how he puts it right at the beginning of his account of the early history of the church. This event happened when the Holy Spirit descended on the assembled disciples in the upper room. They were all in. It's really beautiful to think about this. They were all in one place, in one accord, in one mind. They were all, in other words, not only gathered physically together, which was necessary, but they also had a common understanding or mind accord in how they understood things. And then at the end of the chapter there, when Pentecost, like the sun sets on this first day of church history, 3,000 people convert, things like this happen. Peter gives a phenomenal sermon that touches the hearts of the listeners, and they repent and are prepared to be baptized. At the end, it's one verse, Acts 2:42, which I make a lot out of in Age of Paradise, chapter 1, I think. Acts 2:42 has like four marks of, like four normative marks of church life from that point forward, from day one forward. What's interesting is these four marks of church life are all preceded by the statement, the Christians continued, they didn't like do this for a while and then stop, steadfastly, unchangeably. They continued steadfastly in these things. They didn't, leave them open to imagination, reconfiguration, reevaluation later on. They continued steadfastly in. And then these four marks are mentioned there, which are, the apostles' doctrine, and the breaking of the bread, and the fellowship, and the prayers. Of course, that's not everything in church life, but that's four marks. And I try to make a lot out of that as a kind of a cultural statement, a cultural historian, even though that wasn't real intention as such. So that's Pentecost, and that's the beginning of church history. Of course, we all know that there's a term called Pentecostal that is applied to some Protestants today. And what that usually refers to is a form of Protestant Christianity, which is really focused on appropriating and experiencing spiritual gifts, the gift of the Holy Spirit, and acting in a charismatically spiritual way, sometimes with kind of wild and crazy worship ceremonies and things like that, speaking in tongues, stuff like this that are so considered to be a mark of spiritual communion, which we Orthodox, just never really did. And Paul even spoke, cautiously about in his own epistles. But this desire by Protestants, maybe we'll want to talk about this later, I think, is a sign of the consequences of breaking from the original Pentecostal church, as it were, and being bereft of spiritual experience, liturgical, sacramental experience, such as I describe in the first volume, The Age of Paradise.
And just for those listening who might, I know a lot of my audience can be what I would call ortho-curious. Those four things you mentioned from Acts, I think it's 2:42, that's never stopped within the lineage of Orthodoxy, correct?
Yes, I would say for sure. The Orthodox Church, is famous and among some infamous, notorious for the principle of unchangeability. Like the old joke about how many Orthodox bishops does it take to change a light bulb? Change. Right. We don't do that. So unchangeable is our approach to the tradition of the church. It doesn't mean like, St. Paul walked around with a cassock on or something like that, or a cross around his neck. Of course, things are added and articulated generation from generation. So the idea of change, has a place maybe, but certainly what the apostles' doctrine was, the first of those four principles, the Orthodox today would argue is unchanged. It's exactly the same. And that's not only theological doctrine, but that would be like moral doctrine, like, what is marriage? What is male? What is female? Things like this don't change. The apostles didn't hold one understanding of that, and then later on we read Sigmund Freud or whoever it might be, Michel Foucault, and get a new idea. No, we try to keep it unchanged. And then the other marks could be the same could be said about those.
Do you think Orthodoxy gives let's say a correct and solid epistemology and an understanding of what it is to be a human?
So by epistemology, do you mean like a philosophy, a formal kind of theory or philosophy of how understanding occurs, how we understand, discern things?
Yes,
I think so. Although, of course, epistemology is it's a modern philosophical term that's probably been defined more by secular-minded people than by, say, Orthodox fathers or theologians, that kind of thing. But the second half of your question, the human being, absolutely. I mean, that would be my emphasis. In fact, my book series was really presented with two large-scale concepts in mind. One is anthropology and one is
Yes.
cosmology, right? And the two actually overlap with each other. Cosmology being understanding of what the cosmos or world is, and anthropology being understanding of what man, the human being, the anthropos is. And I think that, Orthodox writing today, especially, not just myself, but in far more effectively than myself, bring attention to Orthodox anthropology as really being the thing that's been lost in the modern world
Yes.
with secularization, which we would do very well to recover and kind of instill our culture with. Yes, the Orthodox Church has a very, very clear and compelling account of what it means to be human.
What's up, guys? Your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson here, and you might notice this recording sounds different than the usual podcast, and that is because I'm sitting outside here in Lockhart, Texas, recording this ad into my iPhone. It probably sounds pretty crappy. Well, I'm doing this to show you something very cool. Many of you guys know that my production team works over at Podsworth Media, and they've been producing my show for quite a while. I get a lot of questions and people asking, who does your podcast? Why does it sound great? And I'm telling you why. It's because the guys at Podsworth are amazing. They've got this brand new online app for taking rough recordings like this and making them a whole lot cleaner and more listenable with just a few easy clicks. It will remove background noise. It reduces plosives. It fixes clipping, which is distortion from recording with the gain up too high. Clipping, which is distortion from recording with the gain up too high, which I can promise you I've done many times, and they fixed this for me. It removes clicks and pops. And then also levels out the dialogue, so there's no crazy where the guest sounds too loud or the interviewer sounds too quiet. Here's what you guys can do. All of y'all that are interested in recording podcasts or audiobooks or anything, if you're a pastor and you want your sermon recorded, whatever the case may be, go to podsworth.com and click Get Started. You drag and drop your audio files or click to open your file manager. This also works on your smartphone's web browser. You customize your settings that you want, but the default works fine on most podcast recordings. Then enter code BUCK50, BUCK50 for 50% off of your first order. You don't need an account, just an email address and payment. And you'll get a download link in your email for your cleaned up files. How cool is this? The guys at Podsworth run everything they do through this app before they do anything else to it. So all of my recordings go through this app that we're talking about. It works great. Like I said, any spoken word recordings, obviously for podcasts, YouTube videos, sermons, audiobooks, whatever, it will make awful recordings sound listenable and much more professional. So, like I said, go to podsworth.com and click Get Started. You can use promo code BUCK50, BUCK50 for 50% off of your first order. You can use promo code BUCK50, BUCK50 for 50% off of your first order. Let's get it.
Yes. I think it's just a note. I think that it would be helpful for folks to dive into that who are frustrated seeing what's going on around us with, all of the political craziness of the moment. And what's a woman, etc. That's just my thought. I do want to talk about the Great Schism, what you call the Great Divide, and why, maybe what led up to it and what exactly made it so pivotal as far as the direction things headed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it is pivotal for my narrative. So I have 4 books, and after the first book that covers the first millennium, Age of Paradise, the Age of Division picks up with the Great Division, and from that point forward, everything's kind of set in motion. So I think it is pivotal. It is pivotal. So the Great Division, the word Great Schism is usually used. Well, schism is just from a Greek word. It means division. So we can go back to division itself. The Great Division, Great Divide was the way you spoke of it. The Great Division came about when more or less Eastern and more or less Western Christians, and especially their leadership, no longer worked together to try to resolve their differences and misunderstandings, and simply resolved or settled on no longer being in communion with each other. Now, I take this seriously because a lot of people, I think this is one of the reasons why people haven't looked to this event as much as, say, to the Enlightenment or the sexual revolution to understand the rise and fall of what the West once was. Because there's really not a whole lot of appreciation for ecclesiology, for what the church is, and how the church cultivates a sacramental liturgical life that provides a source of inspiration for culture. More satisfying for a modern mind is just the pure intellectual study of ideas, right? And so the Enlightenment provides us with ideas, new ideas. The sexual revolution, the hippie movement, the countercultural movement of the 60s provides new ideas, this kind of thing. So I think that this really is where we're going to find the root cause of the shifting of ideas later on. And the Great Schism came about because, as I say, there was just no longer a desire or a commitment to maintaining unity, sacramental unity between East and West. What happened? I mean, I narrate all of this in chapter 1 of Age of Division, and an interesting argument has been made recently by a professor at Ohio State University that I make use of, that documents the actual events of 1054, the fateful year when excommunications were exchanged between Rome and Constantinople. But his name is Caldelis, and he wrote an article that documents the activities of the one who kind of started the schism. His name was Cardinal Humbert. He was sent by the Pope of Rome, Leo IX, to Constantinople to confront the Patriarch of Constantinople and also engage the Emperor of Byzantium. And while he's en route, the Pope dies, making legally his embassy there no longer legitimate. But he went forward anyway. He almost certainly knew he was now on his own. The Pope who had sent him was no longer alive to give him legitimacy. But he was really, really ideologically, doctrinally committed to subordinating the East to the West. And when he got there, he finally and famously, infamously, threw down a bull of excommunication on the altar table of Hagia Sophia there in Constantinople, and then departed. And as a result, the Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Cerularius was his name, issued a kind of complimentary excommunication against Humbert. And this mutual excommunication of 1054 is usually seen as like, if we want one event, that's it. And it's a pretty satisfactory event. It was a breach or break in communion. But of course, it took centuries to get there. And then it took centuries later for it to finally, resolve into what we today would consider to be the very different churches called, in our vocabulary, the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church.
And
that was the Great Schism.
And then from there, just I want to kind of make a timeline that my listeners can picture. Orthodox, there's a chart you can even see where the Orthodox kept this same line. The Catholic Church breaks apart, and then offshoots from the Catholic Church happen. And you discuss this in your book too. Can you kind of go over some of those big steps along the way?
Yeah, sure. And actually, even before 1054, there was, of course, the very large, very significant, very tragic schism with the Monophysites or the non-Chalcedonians, which happened centuries earlier. That often, in fact, in my book too, doesn't get a whole lot of attention just because they wind up kind of in the south and in North Africa and other places like that, Egypt, and don't really fit into what we consider to be modern Western history. But that was another schism that took place, and it was also a great schism that took place. But from 1054 forward, to use that turning point, what happens is you get more and more committedly a definition of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, which the Orthodox have always and still hold to, that is now defined by affiliation with and subordination to the office of the Bishop, Pope of Rome. And so it's appropriate to call them now this Roman Catholicism. I don't like to use the word Catholicism. I totally respect that some people do, and that's fine when, especially for a Roman Catholic to do so. I get that, but I mean, I think the Orthodox have a claim. I don't think I know. We have a claim to the adjective Catholic. We don't speak of Catholicism as such, but it was our saint Ignatius of Antioch who coined the word Catholic, or didn't maybe coin it. He didn't do that, but first used it to define the church in the 2nd century. That epistles of Ignatius of Antioch are the earliest use of the word Catholic, I think, that we have. He's our saint, and this is our concept of things. But anyway, be that as it may, from that point forward, people speak of a Roman Catholic Church that for about a half a millennium, about 500 years, continued to have a really distinct identity, which more and more was distinct from and different from, and deviated, in my argument, from original Christianity, which was still kept in the Orthodox Church in a more or less unchangeable form. In Byzantium, before Byzantium collapsed in the face of the Islamic conquests of Turkey, of the Ottoman Empire, modern Turkey, and then also in Russia, though Russia also suffered from a Mongol invasion during this period. So from about the 11th century to about the 16th century, about 500 years, the Roman Catholic Church starts to establish a very clear identity where she is not Eastern, she is not Greek. In fact, a lot of the theologians that were kind of defining Roman Catholicism at this time often, identified, isolated, kind of objectified the so-called Greek church as being a church of schismatics and in some ways heretics. Gregory Palamas, for instance, was attacked from this point of view, and things like that. And then you get what an Orthodox would say are additions to the faith. So you get things like papal supremacy, which is just, and as I document this in the first 2 volumes, just not there. It's just not there until the Great Schism, and then it's really elaborated. So to the point where Boniface VIII issues his famous Unum Sanctum Bull in the early 1300s that says, it is altogether necessary for the salvation of every human being to be subject to the Pope of Rome. Well, that's just not a definition of ecclesiology that you see until the Papal Reformation. And then there are other things too. Purgatory is one of them. There are changes and shifts in the piety. There's much more attention now to the crucifixion of Christ and his physical suffering on the cross. There's a piety that infuses people with a sense of strong guilt that they caused Jesus to suffer, and paintings begin to appear. We might want to talk a little bit about art and beauty and stuff like that. Paintings begin to appear during this period, which are designed to create a psychological and very subjective sense of guilt and agony in the believer, to, again, for good reasons, to cultivate love for and gratitude toward Christ who died for the sins of the world. But it just starts to create a kind of a mindset or piety in the West that uprooted it from that experience of communion with God that was at the center of a healthy Christian culture during the first millennium, grounded in liturgy and sacraments. So there are many other things that we could talk about that begin to define Roman Catholicism.
And then, when did the break-aparts come where you get Protestantism off of that? I've heard, and let me ask you this just to make sure, I have heard someone say that I'm close with, I'm not just, it's not just someone out in the abyss, but someone I'm close with said Protestantism can be seen as a reductionist form of Catholicism. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, well, it depends on what you mean by reductionist, but I do, in the Age of Division, begin with the the Papal Reformation, forming Roman Catholicism, and I end it with the Protestant Reformation.
Yes,
I see a Reformation beginning in the 11th century in what came to be known as the Roman Catholic Church, a Reformation which continues and finds its culmination in the Protestant Reformation. So in that sense, I see a real linkage between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. And many Orthodox in the West, we grow up hearing nothing about Orthodoxy,
right?
And then we convert to Orthodoxy, and many of us comment, from our new point of view, from the Orthodox point of view, we look at the Roman Catholic Protestant divide, which seems for many in the West just to be the only two options in Christianity.
Right.
Orthodoxy is not known. But once you see things from an Orthodox or Eastern point of view, you see that the two are really two sides of the same coin. Protestantism is, in that sense, a reductionist Catholicism, in the sense that it really has the forms of Catholicism, but in a reduced kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
Here, I would say, it's the solas. It's like, again, Protestantism defined itself originally against something, of course, against Roman Catholicism, circa 1500.
Yes.
A Roman Catholicism, which every Roman Catholic today would agree had significant problems in it. The rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica with all of its marble and glory and pagan features and all that kind of stuff freaked Luther out, and others like Calvin. And so they were reacting against what they considered to be like the decrepitude or the debasement of Christianity in its current form, Roman Catholic, a la Roman Catholicism. They knew very little about the Orthodox Church. There were some efforts to contact Orthodox theologians and such, but they didn't go very far. And so really what we find then is that Protestantism bears a lot of its origins, and its origins are Roman Catholic.
And when was that? Because I've heard people discuss this with me, and from my small amount of knowledge on it, I could tell their timeline was a bit off. I didn't want to correct them, so I'd rather someone who knows a little bit more about it than me discuss kind of when that Protestant Reformation happened and kind of then the road that started going down.
Yeah. And I'm not a historian of the Protestant Reformation as such, so there are people who know a lot more about the Protestant Reformation or about Roman Catholicism, obviously, than I do. So I don't want to pretend I'm some sort of expert at this. But I mean, of course, if we want to date 1517 as the date that Martin Luther presents his 95 Theses against the sale of indulgences being a practice that grows out of purgatory, which was never part of the Orthodox ethos or the early Christian ethos. So 1517 would be a hard date to use because it's after that event that controversy arises between Martin Luther and the official leadership of the Roman Catholic Church at that time, which results in Luther burning the papal bull of excommunication in the marketplace, and other Melanchthon and other Zwingli and other Protestants, getting inspired to do likewise. And Calvin then comes along a little bit later, and then there's the Reformation in England and stuff like that. So 1517 is a hard date. There were clearly, every historical event, just like 1054, the Great Schism.
Yeah.
Every historical event has, things leading to it, and historians are right and correct to see what was leading up to this. And there was a lot leading up to this event in 1517, for sure.
So much of this is, again, I mean, I think I'm seeing it from the way you're painting it very wonderfully is, it's like the break apart happens, then some bad things happen, and then there's a reaction to those bad things happening, and then they create more bad things without ever going back to the original good. And that kind of seems the trail we're going down here. You did mention art and beauty a few minutes ago. How was that affected after the Great Division?
That's a fascinating story. And I take it up in Age of Utopia. I actually talk about an Age of Division too, but it really explodes in the Renaissance, which I cover in the Age of Utopia, the third volume. So what happened? I mean, again, so a liturgical and sacramental culture, or a culture rooted in liturgical sacramental experience, as was Christendom in the first millennium for the most part, is a culture in which art is going to be celebrated, art is going to be projected and developed and elaborated in a very specific and well-defined way, with a purpose. And that purpose is prayer. The purpose is liturgy. The purpose is worship. The purpose is establishing and supporting faithful Christians in communion with God. And so what we have then in that first millennium is the development and expansion of what's called iconography, the painting of or writing of icons, images. The word icon just means image in Greek. Images. There were controversies like the iconoclastic heresy that said you can't do that. The second commandment forbids it. And that would come back up again among Calvinists in the Protestant Reformation. But in fact, that was a real misreading of the Old Testament and an expression of total, almost willful ignorance that things had been completed in the incarnate Christ, so that the Old Testament law was not an absolute law at that point. I mean, just really quickly, this is kind of catechetical and maybe doesn't belong here so much, but the second commandment, you shall make no graven icons or images of things in heaven, things on earth, or things below the earth. It's the second commandment. That's pretty important stuff. That's Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 25 says, now go make, it doesn't say graven images, but it basically says make images of angels for the Ark of the Covenant, for the curtains of the temple. So it wasn't an absolute commandment when it was first given in Exodus 20. 5 chapters later, the same Holy Scripture reflects a commandment by God to do this sort of thing. But what really mattered in combating this attack on art, Christian liturgical art, iconography especially, was the incarnation. If God really became human in Jesus Christ, if the incarnation is real, not a fantasy, not a beautiful idea that doesn't have any manifested visible reality, if that's the case, then we need to make icons of Jesus to project and celebrate and proclaim that God became human, became one of us. And furthermore, that through the Holy Spirit, Jesus Christ participates in the lives of and fills the lives of his saints, such as the Virgin Mary, and all down the line, all the saints get icons painted of them as well. So all of this was designed to enhance the liturgical and sacramental conviction of the early Christendom, that God did become human, the incarnation was real, and the cosmos. Remember, I talked about cosmology earlier being really central. The cosmos has been filled with heaven, has been filled with divine presence. Heavenly immanence is a term that I use throughout the first volume, especially. That heaven has become immanent or present in this created world. And as a result of that, icons and other forms of liturgical art were designed to reveal heaven through these artistic means and to stir in people a desire for heaven and an experience of communion with God in a heaven that has now begun to fill the earth in the liturgical life of the church.
Yes, well put. There's a difference I've noticed too. That's a very common understanding among the Orthodox that you can experience Christ here and now. We do it constantly. And then there seems to be a view that some people have where we live our life and then you experience Christ once you die. Do you see that pull and push amongst modern people?
Yes. I mean, I would say that I would want to say and acknowledge that a Roman Catholic or Protestant would never allow any claim that one cannot experience the presence of Christ now. Mm-hmm. And of course, there are many saints' lives from Roman Catholics and many Protestant accounts of ecstatic experiences, of mystical experiences of God's presence and things like this. So I don't want to, I want to acknowledge and honor the fact that for those communities of Christians, my point of view would probably not seem really, by itself convincing or completely acceptable. But I will say, as an Orthodox Christian, there seems to be, historically documented, no question, that that early Christianity, and then this continued in the Orthodox Church after the Great Schism, there's a comparatively greater emphasis upon the presence of God in this world through the sacramental life of the church. One great hero of my book series is Gregory Palamas. He lived in the 14th century, a good time after the Great Schism, and he was confronted by a theologian from the West who started off actually as a Orthodox and then finally converted to Roman Catholicism after losing a kind of a polemic with Gregory Palamas. But he was confronted because Gregory Palamas, seemed to this Western scholastically influenced theologian to place too much emphasis upon the physical, material and cosmic elements of our salvation. And Gregory put it this way. He said that while we can't know God's essence,
Yes.
we can know and participate in directly his energies.
Yes.
And of course, it's easy for someone to say that, on a podcast and not, be able to go very far. I can't go very far into that probably. We can't get too into the really deep theology there. But this is an example of the comparatively greater emphasis placed in the Orthodox Church, in the church, of the first millennium, on the real presence, the heavenly immanence of God in this life through the sacraments.
Mm-hmm.
And iconography did and does a very good job of communicating that. But when in the Roman Catholic Church, after the Great Schism, the Great Division, more attention was given to individual subjective experiences, especially about Christ's suffering and passion, it began to disrupt and uproot that confidence, that experience of communion with God. It began to set people apart from God in a certain psychological sense. This has been commented on by many scholars, and not just Orthodox. I mean, a lot of Western modern scholars have commented on the rise of this affective piety. People can read Rachel Fulton, for instance, which is a really great account of some of this stuff. And then you get purgatory, which says that you might have experiences of God's presence and all that. It didn't reject that in this life, but basically the doctrine of purgatory claims that one must undergo purgation, which most accounts, certainly in the time when it was elaborated over centuries, were basically punishments, suffering and punishments, hell-like sufferings and punishments. One can read the Purgatory of St. Patrick, which is just a harrowing account of just nothing but violence and horrid, dreadful things happening to one in order to be purged to emerge on the other side in paradise. And so if paradise then is the experience that the Orthodox Church has always cultivated from Pentecost forward, has always cultivated in the sacramental life of the Church, it became restricted more and more in the piety and doctrines of Roman Catholicism after the Great Schism. And then you get to the Protestant Reformation, and it goes even further. So back to your basic question is, I think what you asked is, if I correct, what happened in the West that began to change the view of art? Art now became designed not to bring a sense of communion with God, but a sense of anguish over one's sins that would cause a certain repentance and a passage through purgatory that was swifter and less. This kind of post-mortem punishment would not be such a barrier between life in this age and paradise or communion later on. Then you get to the Renaissance, and things take a totally new direction where communion with God and paradise and heavenly immanence no longer even play a role. And they don't, because I argue in Age of Utopia, they don't play a role because people like Petrarch, the father of humanism, and a lot of the early Renaissance painters and artists were fed up with this experience of guilt and suffering and anguish and anxiety. Martin Luther was driven by anxiety and driving the Reformation. This anxiety was now the result of an art that no longer emphasized that communion.
This is the book we mentioned earlier, and a lot of my listeners I know have read it at this point because I've talked about it a lot. Nihilism, the Root and the Revolution of the Modern Age. Within that, and I want to get your comments on this because you discussed these topics in your series, Father Seraphim Rose wrote and spoke about the revolutionary movements, having a similar spirit, communism, fascism, liberalism, and whatnot. Do you see that same kind of spirit within? Because there's always these, well, no, this one was right wing, this one was left wing, and this one's somewhere in the middle. And there's always these political surface level arguments on certain revolutionary movements. But do you see them to have a general similar spirit?
Yeah, I think I do see things very similarly to Father Seraphim there. He uses the word revolutionary movement. I mean, his his writing was like 1970s, more or less. He died in the early 80s. That's still during the Cold War, and there's still this sense like, that's fine. That's fine. I think revolutionary movements are too broad a term for me. The French Revolution was another movement, or the English Revolution or stuff like that. What I see, I use the word ideology instead of revolution here. Ideology, where a secular principle or principles now govern how civilization and its supporting culture operate.
Yes.
But I think it's basically the same thing. And so here we have, the great revolutionary movements for him. For me, ideological movements of the 20th century are communism, Nazism, or we call it fascism, socialism, fascism, or communism, Nazism, to give more specific terms. Communism, Nazism, and progressivism. And I see progressivism as being really a form of liberalism,
yes,
which was always set against communism and fascism, and of course, which dominated the United States and the West throughout the Cold War period, beginning with the end of the Second World War, and of course coming to power even earlier than that. And I see these as efforts to I call them counterfeits of Christianity.
Yes,
I see humanism as a counterfeit, an artificial replacement for a Christianity, namely a Western Christianity, namely a heterodox Christianity, which has ceased to hold the culture together, has ceased to hold the world together, has ceased to inspire people. And the Enlightenment was obviously a reaction against that kind of Christianity. The Protestant Reformation was marked by horrendous wars of annihilation between Roman Catholic and Protestant armies, wars in which the Orthodox Church did not participate. And so many people in the 18th century look back on these wars and said, like, let's get away from Christianity as a social, cultural influence and just use pure reason to try to make sense of a happier civilization living in the world for its own sake rather than in the world as a means of communing with God sacramentally. And that failed. That's called humanism, and it failed. By the end of the 19th century, Nietzsche was like the first kind of prophet of its failure. Dostoevsky at the same time was doing the same. And then World War I made that very clear that had failed. And so the revolutionary movements that Seraphim Rose spoke of really arose out of an effort to react to this nihilism and to create some sort of late humanistic world organizing, or I call it in the book, world building project. We're going to build the world around healthy, positive ideals like, an absence of economic suffering and class conflict, communism. We're going to rebuild the world around a stable, healthy national culture called Nazism. We're going to rebuild the world around the inviolability of the individual and his absolute freedom to do as he pleases and believe what he pleases, liberalism. And these all had, of course, certain elements in them were humanistic, but they were also very nihilistic. Mm-hmm. And in the chapters of Age of Nihilism, I talk about the place of Nietzsche, of all people, in each of those three movements. And he is to be found there. He did have a place because of his nihilism. And all of that, these revolutionary movements, these ideologies, I think what they do for us living in our age, I think, Buck, is that they give us, like, it's kind of a test. Like, can we really build a world that's really perfect on its own terms, a real secular world? Because they're all secular ideologies. They're all secular. Yes. Can we do this? And of course, the answer is a resounding no. Nazism was just a horrendous, monstrous system, just unspeakably brutal and cruel. Communism had maybe some high ideals in it, like the end of class conflict and the end of racism and stuff like that. But it did so through such an anti-human violence and horrendous brutality. And finally, progressivism or liberalism, while not, organized violence as such in most cases, nevertheless is just disintegrated. And so I think the answer is no. And that's inspiring for us who now, as the 21st century moves forward, we can look back on that and say, hey, as Christians, even as Orthodox Christians who identify with a culture that's, a millennium old, we have something to say to to an age, to a generation that has to admit it has not worked out to try to build a secular utopia.
Were the postmodern thinkers, was their philosophy something that helped, I would say, nihilism flourish in your mind?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's no question about it. Postmodernism in its origins in the 1960s is really influenced by Nietzsche. I mean, not that that makes it nihilistic as such, but Nietzsche, you know, in my book, and most people, including Seraphim Rose, agree that Nietzsche is really he can be called a nihilist in a lot of ways, very significant ways. And he might not have accepted that himself, but in some ways he did actually proclaim it. He philosophized with a hammer, he liked to say. In other words, crush it all, destroy it all, we'll rebuild later, but we won't build anything that lasts or anything that has any objective truth to it. So that's pretty nihilistic. And so some of the famous, founders of postmodernist theory, French, in most cases, some Americans, but I'm thinking about the French people like Jacques Lyotard and Jacques Derrida, and especially Michel Foucault, who's featured in my Age of Nihilism because of his remarkable and appalling moral life that he died from. Michel Foucault is a real good example of nihilism in a sophisticated postmodern form. And I think that really overlaps quite well with what we see in our universities today, where a lot of postmodernist sociologists and anthropologists and historians and political scientists and artists, and so forth are active. There's a place for this kind of nihilism in the institutions of our progressive culture in the West today. Mm-hmm. You see it in Hollywood, a lot of the movies. I document some of these movies in my Age of Nihilism, movies that have a very nihilistic kind of point of view, also very postmodernist in that sense.
Do you think, are we still in the age of nihilism, or are we moving, I don't know, the age of transhumanism, or is that all related? Where do you think we are now in that regard?
Yeah, well, I chose the 4 volumes. I chose, I had to come up with, a noun for each. I had to come up with a characterizing word for each, and I would say nihilism, best, more than any other single word, describes the past century pretty well.
Yes.
Certainly that part of the century that I wanted to narrate in my book. I don't see it as at an end now. Okay. I see it more open to criticism than it was, say, 50 years ago. I think it would be very hard to reach the conclusions that a lot of us are reaching today. 50 years ago, say in the 1950s in America, I think it would be very hard for a lot of us to reach these conclusions. But I think now, seeing, say, the liberal progressive establishment in America having gone further down its road by the early 21st century, we can say, like with, let's say transgenderism, let's just use that, or post-humanism, transhumanism, right? These things, I think, are categorically dark and ugly and dangerous and wrong and fundamentally flawed. Anyone would have seen this back in the 1950s. I mean, there's no way any of this stuff would have been allowed. I mean, same-sex marriage laws, for instance, a White House, spread with the colors of the pride flag when the Obergefell and Hodges decision was reached. Things like this can you imagine the Eisenhower administration doing that? Right. I mean, it would not happen. Right. It would not happen. So I think we are at a point now where we can see where this has gone and the harm this has done and is doing and promises to do to the West as long as it continues in a way that we couldn't 50 years ago. But I don't see us at an end. I think it's going to take more time for if there's a recovery, if there's a restitution of a healthier culture, one as I would like to see grounded in Orthodox Christianity, there would have to be a real conviction to return to what I call throughout the books traditional Christianity. Yes. And by this, I try to, leave it open for Protestants and Roman Catholics to find their own way, not necessarily an Orthodox Christian way like me, but find their own way back to the first millennium and the value of the civilization and culture of that time.
You led me You led me perfectly right into what I was about to ask you. What is the, let's say, I don't always like to say the biggest or the most, but for lack of a better term, what's the biggest truth of traditional Christianity, do you think, that's been lost on modern society? The West, let's say.
Well, I would argue, I mean, this is kind of more it's more complex than you probably want a simple answer. I would argue that it's a loss of liturgical consciousness, to use a kind of a lame sounding phrase. Oh, better put, sacramentality. Let's leave it at that. Sacramentality. Of course, every Protestant and Roman Catholic for sure believe in sacramentality. I shouldn't say everyone, but certainly a lot of any Roman Catholic, I think, who identifies with the Roman Catholic tradition, and most Protestants, Episcopalian, Lutheran, or whatever, would recognize sacraments are a big part of being a Christian and participating in the life of the world around oneself. But I think that what's really, what I document in the book series is the rise of a sacramentally affirmative culture, the first millennium, and then a culture of the West after the Great Schism, the Great Division, which becomes, at first, sacramentality becomes distorted and then finally gets thrown out the window altogether. Some Protestants like Calvin, largely rejected the sacraments. His disciple, John Knox, who helped form the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, liked to say about the Eucharist, Jesus is in heaven and not here. And he was speaking about the physical presence,
right?
But to say that just so well expresses everything I've been trying to say is heaven is here.
Yes,
in the paradisiacal culture that Christendom cultivated in the first millennium, and which continued to in the Orthodox Church after that, at least before the Orthodox started facing all sorts of challenges like communism and Islam and so forth. That sacramental culture, that paradisiacal principle, is what's been lost. And I think the record of modern history has been largely the record of efforts to find a counterfeit for sacramentality. And back to Seraphim Rose's insights, which I think I do more or less adhere to in my book, the three great world-building projects of communism, Nazism, and progressivism, liberalism, are projects to find in the world something stirring and wonderful and worth living for that is in the end, a counterfeit of communion with God.
Well put. I'll let you, it's going to be hard to top what you just said, but I'll give you the floor if you have any parting comments for people that are just hearing this stuff, any messages you'd like to get to my audience, anything you'd like.
I don't think I have much more to say, Buck. I do appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about this, and I really enjoy your podcast a lot. I've been listening a little bit recently, and I really enjoy it. So, I don't think I have much more to say.
You certainly get to plug your work, though. In any of it, podcasts, your blog, your books.
Well, sure. If people are interested in what they've been hearing about, the book series is called Paradise and Utopia: The Rise and Fall of What the West Once Was. It's available through Ancient Faith Publishing. It's also available through other vendors, online vendors. It's all been published now. You can even buy the whole thing all together at a discount, I think, or individual volumes. Each volume was written specifically, and the editors really wanted me to do this, and I agreed totally that it was the right thing to do. Each volume's written to be a kind of a standalone book, so one can pick up any of the 4 volumes, and they should have a sense of what I've said in earlier volumes. You don't necessarily need to read it from the beginning, and then it has some parallel support in a podcast I did with a similar title, Paradise and Utopia: Reflections on the Rise and Fall of Christendom, which I did with Ancient Faith Radio, and it's an ongoing. It hasn't actually reached its end yet, but my work has reached its end. It's just a matter of kind of communicating the last episodes there. The podcast was designed to give me an ability, a platform to start thinking through the book series. And so for several years, I was doing podcasting before I actually started publishing the book. And so it's got some content in it that's not found in the books, but the books are really a standalone and more finished product than the podcast, which is more like a scholar's notebook than anything else. And then I have a blog site. It's just johnstrickland.org, where I need to put more content up there, but that has had some written stuff on it as well that I put up there. So
I will link to all of that in the show notes page for this episode. And I will say, I would give my own endorsement. The podcast series is a great companion to the books. It's for people, maybe you have to have a certain mind, I don't know, but hearing you discuss it and then reading it at the same time is very helpful. And if it's the audiobook, I think the first volume's on audiobook, and I believe it's you reading it.
It is me, yeah.
Yes.
As lame as my voice might sound at times, the editor was writing back saying, pick it up a little bit, or, I can hear your chair creaking in the background. You have to read it. Takes a while. I've actually done the second 2 volumes already, completed those. Those should be released before too long. And then I have to record Age of Nihilism. And my editor tells me all of those should be available as audiobooks by the fall sometime.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Father John Strickland, thank you so much for being here on Counterflow.
Yeah, thank you, Buck. It's been really enjoyable.
Yes, sir. All right, I hope you guys got a lot out of that interview. I highly recommend this book series. I think after hearing that interview, there's going to be many of you going and buying these books. And again, I recommend it. Also, my friend Adam Patrick on the Age of Information, I think he's got 3 episodes out now. Just go to his page and check it out, where some people are reading through part of the first book in this series, if you like to do it that way. And like we said here in this interview on Audible, it's Father John Strickland himself reading at least the first volume. And I listen to that quite often, as well as read through it. So either way, I think you're going to enjoy the content of these books. So as for this show, let's see. Don't forget, I told you this Thursday, Father Turbo, my spiritual father, one of my favorite people on the planet, will be the guest in our live Zoom call, patreon.com/counterflow, $5 or more per month. Get in that. It's going to be fun. And counterflowpodcast.com is the website. Go to the YouTube page, hit subscribe, all of those good things. Follow me on Twitter @BuckRebel, BuckRebel. And next week, boy, do we have a good one. I don't know if y'all are aware of Michael Witkoff's new book, aka Brother Augustine, his new book. He's on next week. It's a spicy topic. We're going to talk all about it. There's your hint. There is your hint. Until next week, God bless. You guys have a good one. See ya.
You get split in half, like on the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Counterflow podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.